Welcome to Transbiblical, a podcast where we talk about how gender variation is as ancient as stories about creation. In fact, that's the very first sentence in the new book, Transbiblical. My name is Katie E. Valentine. This is a limited series podcast, and I'm going to bring you authors and friends of the book.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Transbiblical. This time we have a wonderful author in the book, Aysha Musa. Hey, Dr. Aysha Musa. Hey, Aysha, how are you today?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I'm so great. We were saying right before we started recording that we're real people and we both have like 3 dogs between us. So we're trying to record around the activity of the dogs.
They might join in, who knows?
They may join in. They are they should really be cited in everything that I write.
Absolutely.
Companions and editors. So, well, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
So my name's Aysha and currently I'm a teacher, but I did most of my academic studying at the University of Sheffield. I fell by accident into the field of gender studies and queer studies. I was questioning other elements of my life and other binarizations in my life. So I'm mixed race, I'm half Indian, I'm half English. And I kind of fell into this world of questioning binaries, and that led me to queer studies, where I've found my heart and my home. So all my work now really works to challenge binaries, but specifically gender binaries.
I love it. And that's what you do in this chapter too. So you talk about Jael, and we'll get more into that in just a moment. So in that challenging binaries, that fits right up the alley of, I'm sure, listeners to this. Tell us, so why did you say yes to this project, to being part of Transbiblical?
Something that's really important to me is to represent groups of people that aren't always represented in the mainstream and are often marginalized. And one thing that always struck me as really unusual is that for me, trans characters, trans people are really evident in the Bible, yet the mainstream either don't acknowledge them, they erase them, or there's absolutely no recognition of their existence and therefore no celebration of their contributions. So this was a great opportunity for me to work towards demarginalizing this group that's just as valid as every other group, especially in the Bible. They are celebrated, and I wanted to do that through this publication.
That's so exciting. And I don't know if this is similar to your experience. When I first started doing this work almost 10 years ago, I found that we just assumed a binary.
Absolutely.
Readers, scholar, whoever, I think it's natural, it's human. We assume our prejudices and our assumptions that those must be universal.
Absolutely. And I think there's a scholar, Asha Grave, and she works with archaeology, and she says that it's engraved in everything that she does, everything that archaeologists do, everything that literary scholars do, everything down to the clothes we pick and whether we think someone's name fits what they visually represent. So our lives are filled with binaries, and they don't really need to be.
Yeah, I love that they don't need to be. That's perfect. And that's just a perfect segue into your work and what you do. So your chapter is Jael's Gender-Ambiguous Motherhood. Give us a brief overview, like what can someone expect as a major takeaway after they read your chapter?
What we think we know about motherhood doesn't have to be the limit to motherhood, that a gendered role can break out of those gendered expectations. And with this character in particular, there's so much more to them than we first realize. There's so much more than meets the eye, and that's celebrated in the Bible.
I love that. And let's maybe just give a really brief synopsis of the story of Jael first, because I think people are going to be familiar with her there. Oh, see, I do it too. Binary assumptions just creep in. But with their counterpart, Deborah, people might know the name Deborah. Jael, they might be a little less familiar with. So just give us 1 minute. What happens in this story?
So it's juicy. Jael is on the outskirts of a battle, and the Canaanite general kind of runs away from the battle and ends up near Jael's tent. And Jael invites Sisera into their tent and ends up looking after them, nurturing them, but also seducing them, and then ultimately murdering them by putting a tent peg through their skull. So it is juicy. There's all sorts of genres going on there. But ultimately, Jael is represented in a feminine way. and I feel that just ignores some of their actions. This narrative is kind of duplicated. So there's Judges 4 and then there's Judges 5, and the narrative's duplicated, and we get almost a different perspective, almost a different angle, but the same narrative. So Judges 4 very much looks at Deborah and Jael as these female characters that win the battle for the Israelites, whereas Judges 5 retells the same story, but partly from Sisera's mother's perspective, where she's waiting for him to come home and worrying about him. That's obviously a very, very short explanation and quite simplistic, but the interesting thing about this narrative is that there's two. There's the prose in Judges 4, and then there's the poetic version in Judges 5, but they work together really nicely. They don't contradict each other. They're two perspectives of the same story.
And listeners, you may be familiar with Jael because she often gets touted about in a really funny meme where there's a Renaissance painting with her like stabbing with a tent peg, and it says like, my idea of biblical womanhood.
Yeah, it's great.
Or something like that.
Again, we've got that binarization of biblical womanhood.
Yeah.
But absolutely, Jael is well known, but like you said, Deborah's probably better known.
Yeah. So the story, when I was rereading it before we started recording, I was like, well, the story never really calls Jael a mother. So explain your title to us. Why do you explore this theme of motherhood, and is Jael being gender ambiguous? Just give us an overview. What's going on there?
I like that it's not explicit about Jael being a mother or playing a mother role. Yet scholarship has gone absolutely crazy and really jumped on board with the theme of motherhood. And that's largely because the narrative begins with Deborah, who's said to be a mother in Israel, and ends with Sisera's mother. So Jael is very much sandwiched between these two mothers and almost like a mediating mother. The behaviours, the personality, the skills, the characteristics that we see of Deborah and Sisera's mother are mediated by Jael. She's the middle character, the middle counterpart. So what Deborah might do is very extremely masculine, and what Sisera's mother might do would be very extremely feminine, and Jael tends to be somewhere in between that. So I call it a matrix of motherhood. We're given two very distinct ideas of motherhood in the Bible, and Jael embodies both simultaneously, which is what is fascinating to me. And we have other characters in the Bible that are often considered to be women, for example, Judith or Esther, and they are symbolically considered mothers of Israel. And part of that is because they don't have biological children. Part of that is because they are assumed to be female or feminine characters. And part of that is because of the efforts they go to save the children of Israel. And that phrase, the children of Israel, again, plays into our theme of motherhood, that idea of children needing to be saved or rescued by their mothers. So although the text doesn't explicitly call Jael a mother, it ambiguously presents Jael as a mother. And we'll find that ambiguity is the word for the book of Judges in general, but certainly for Judges 4 and 5, ambiguity is what it's all about.
And so when you say gender ambiguous, is that different or the same as non-binary?
So it's, in a nutshell, it's the same. But the reason I choose to talk about gender ambiguity almost synonymously with non-binary is to highlight that there is a theme of ambiguity here. It's not just about Jael's non-binary status. It's about ambiguity being celebrated and being at the forefront, and that lack of binarization being what is so important in the text. And gender ambiguity is just one element of ambiguity that is being put on a pedestal. Okay.
So the ambiguity. So you said something very intriguing, which is that Judges is kind of an ambiguous book. Just even if we're a little bit away from your chapter and your story on Jael, tell us a little bit more. What do you mean by that?
Well, I will stay focused on Jael because there's so many ambiguities.
Yeah.
For example, there's ambiguity with Jael's name. Jael is a masculine name. it's the masculine form. There is a feminine form, but the masculine form is used. And Jael as a masculine name is used elsewhere outside of the Bible, but corresponding time period. There's other ambiguities. For example, Jael is liminal in a geographical sense. We aren't sure where she is in consideration to the Israelites and the Canaanites. There's ambiguity regarding whether Jael is married to a man called Heber, because this term can be translated as a clanship group. So is Jael the wife of Heber or just a clan member of Heber and the Kenites? There's ambiguity regarding Jael's relationship with Deborah, and Darren Guest does an amazing work on this, where she's using different hermeneutics and different methodology, but again, really just zooming in on the ambiguity and the intentional ambiguity. But there are so many levels of ambiguity in this text that it would take a number of publications, a number of PhDs even, but we might touch on some of them later because there are many and they're fascinating.
That's really cool about the name. And so those of you who are really picking up on the L in this, in her name, that might kind of clue us into the some of the gender ambiguity with her. Well, so tell us a little bit more, like what are other parts of the story that kind of clue us in that she may be gender ambiguous, that she may be non-binary, or they may be?
So there's a number of elements, but they kind of lead us away from motherhood. So I'll touch on them briefly and then get back to the motherhood. But there is the tent peg that is used to murder Sisera, and this has really clear phallic symbolism. There's a real clear idea of that masculine penetration. So if we're talking about other elements, then the way that Jael invites Sisera into the tent is also really interesting, because Jael takes command of the situation. There's a strange man heading towards Jael's tent, and rather than exhibiting what we would expect from biblical women, which would be fear to protect themselves, whether that's physically or sexually, Jael invites Sisera in. We've got another really interesting ambiguity that really is a big flag that Jael's gender should be considered. Sisera uses a masculine form of a command, almost like Sisera would command men. So Sisera has the option of commanding this woman, if Jael is to be believed to be a woman, but instead Sisera commands Jael as a man. They use the masculine terms. Anyone that's particularly interested in the Hebrew and the gendering of words and terms, Wold, W-O-L-D-E, does some amazing work on this. But all these ambiguities in the text, they all point towards Jael's gender being ambiguous as well. So we've got the ambiguous gendered name, we've got the ambiguous gendered commands, we've got the ambiguous behavior, we've got assertiveness, we've got masculine, stereotypically masculine behaviors that are being attributed to Jael. But if we look at the motherhood specifically, what we expect from biblical mothers is that they protect their children, and that can often be done by hiding the children. That can be done by misleading whoever's looking for their children. But Jael does this in a different way. Jael protects their child, or their children of Israel, the children of Israel, with violence, with really assertive, controlling, manipulative, almost violent behavior. And that's really, really clearly mirrored in Deborah's behaviors of motherhood. And it's absolutely not mirrored in Sisera's mother's behaviors of motherhood. However, Sisera's mother is much more feminine. So we see more of the biblical expectations of her worrying, wondering where her child is. And we also see that maternal care from Jael. So Jael exhibits the masculinity of Deborah, but also the femininity of Sisera's mother. And going back to what I said a little bit earlier, seems to be a mediating mother, seems to be a mother that exhibits the same behaviors as Deborah, masculine motherly behaviors, and the same behaviors as Sisera's mother's feminine maternal behaviors.
How this hasn't been made into a mini series, a good one,
Absolutely.
is a little bit beyond me, right?
Watch this space.
Movie makers, this is a gold mine. And often when movies are made about the Bible, they really lean into the gender binaries.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it'd be really interesting if someone could make this and lean into the ambiguity that you really, really clearly laid out. So I love this. Well, tell us a little bit why this is important now.
It's important for two reasons. These are the two main reasons for me. One is that scholarship has been so consumed with binaries, intentionally or unintentionally, that I think a lot of non-binary or characters that don't fit our binary or people that don't fit our binary are present in the biblical text. And like I said earlier, they are celebrated in the biblical text, yet our world today doesn't seem to celebrate this very important group of people. The other element for me that's really important is how this can feed into an individual's life. It's so nice to see yourself reflected in a text.
Yeah.
We know that whether this is about race or age or simply hair color, it's so nice to see ourselves reflected in texts, especially texts that are meant to shape our life and do shape our world, they shape our laws, they shape the way we interact with each other. So I think it's so important for all people to be able to find themselves in the biblical text in whatever capacity, as long as it is positive and celebrated. And Jael is a really lovely example of that.
Yeah, and the world in which this is being published and produced is really different than the one where you wrote it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so the deliberate erasure of non-binary people, especially within North American context, but I think in other places too, is very obvious right now. So I love that you're celebrating and lifting this up, and I think showing, beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's, like you said, a gender ambiguity there. There's not a question about it once you start looking.
And I think the Bible in particular is often weaponized against some minority groups. And it'd be really nice to show that weaponization is completely flawed. It's completely false. We already know it in our hearts, but it's nice to be able to show it academically and from a literary perspective. So I think this weaponization of the Bible doesn't have a foot to stand on anymore. If we're showing that these people and these characters are representing all people and all walks of life in a positive way, there's no reason for the Bible to be weaponized against minorities.
I love it. Well, tell us, people want to follow you and find you. What are you working on, and where are you active, where people might be able to spot you online?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook. And again, it's just my name, Aysha Musa. And I think the next kind of project for me is one of my PhD theses really zoomed in on Jael's seduction / rape of Sisera. Again, looking at the gender implications of that. So although it does delve into some really unpleasant topics, I think it's really important to recognize the gender ambiguity and the way that Jael's character is misrepresented in scholarship often, sometimes purposefully, sometimes completely accidentally. So I'm very much going down the same kind of road with gender ambiguity, but looking at a completely different element of Jael's narrative and a completely different interaction in the Judges 4 and 5.
Lovely. Well, we'll make sure we put those links below. And thank you so much for your work and for being here and being part of Transbiblical. And it's just been
having me.
Yeah, so lovely to talk to you. So see you next time.
See you. Have a great day.
Too.
Thanks so much for listening. Below are links so you can get in touch with Aysha and follow her and her amazing work. You can buy the book. If you're not quite up to buying the book, but you still want to support the podcast, please do share the episode, like and subscribe. All of those things help boost ratings. There's also a link so you can buy me, the creator, a cup of coffee. This is a wonderful podcast that I'm very happy to put out there in the world. But of course, it does have some costs associated with it. Most of all, keep on being you and help spread the good word. Talk to you next time.